You think your God created the world with words, with light and commandments and careful planning. My creator, Mbombo, vomited up the sun. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. He literally threw up the universe because his stomach hurt, and honestly, that explains a lot about why everything is the way it is. But here's what nobody tells you about creation myths. They're not really about how the world began. They're about how we explain why it hurts to exist. And the Mbombo story? It doesn't flinch from that pain. It doesn't dress it up in poetry or promise. It just says, this is violence, and you came from it, and that's the truth. I'm from the Kuba people of the Congo basin, and our creation story doesn't have the polish of your carefully edited holy books. No committee of priests refined it over centuries. No emperor decided which parts were canonical and which were heretical. It came from the mouths of grandmothers who sat with children in the humid darkness and told them the truth about existence before those children could develop the comfortable lies that let you sleep at night. Mbombo, our creator god, didn't architect reality with divine wisdom. He was sick. Alone in endless darkness and water, he felt something terrible building inside him, and when he finally vomited, out came the sun, the moon, the stars, and every living thing. Therefore, creation wasn't an act of love or intention. It was an accident of cosmic indigestion, an expulsion, a rejection of something that couldn't stay inside anymore. But here's what makes this story more honest than most. It doesn't pretend the world was designed for comfort. It doesn't promise that suffering has meaning or that pain serves a purpose. It doesn't tell you there's a plan, that someone's watching, that it all works out in the end. It just says, this is how things began, violently and without plan, and we've been dealing with the aftermath ever since. My uncle once told me, the missionaries came with their book and said God made man in his image, with love and purpose. Then they looked at us and tried to explain why we were suffering under their boots if God loved us so much. They couldn't. But Mbombo explains it perfectly. Nobody planned this, nobody owes you comfort, and the only promise you get is that it ends. So what really happened in those first moments when a god felt sick and changed nothing into everything? What do the specific details reveal about the Kuba understanding of existence, suffering, and the cruel geometry of the universe? And why does this messy, uncomfortable origin story reveal something profound about existence that prettier myths conveniently ignore? Why does vomit, of all things, become the most honest metaphor for creation we have? Before everything, there was Mbombo, just him, floating in absolute darkness, surrounded by primordial water that stretched infinitely in every direction. No land, no sky, no light to see by, though seeing would have been pointless because there was nothing to see. But let me be more specific about what this means. This wasn't the darkness of night, which is just the absence of sun. This was primordial darkness, darkness that existed before light was even a concept. Darkness that didn't know it was dark because there was nothing to contrast it against. The deepest ocean trenches are black, but they're lit compared to what existed before Mbombo vomited. And the water. My grandmothers say he was there for an eternity, but time didn't exist yet, so maybe it was a second, or maybe it was forever. The distinction doesn't matter when you're the only thing that exists. But think about what it means to be alone, not lonely. Loneliness requires the memory or concept of companionship. Mbombo was alone in a way that's impossible to imagine because he'd never been anything else. He was existence itself, consciousness without context, being without purpose. Western philosophers talk about the loneliness of existence, the existential isolation of consciousness. They write whole books about it. The Kuba said it in one image, a god floating in infinite nothing, and even he couldn't stand it. Even divine consciousness needs to expel something, needs to create differentiation, needs to break the unbearable unity of being alone with yourself forever. Therefore, when the elders say Mbombo was alone in the darkness, they're not just setting a scene. They're diagnosing the fundamental problem of existence, Consciousness cannot tolerate absolute unity. Being needs to become beings. One needs to shatter into many, not because it's better, but because it's unbearable not to. But then Mbombo felt something wrong inside himself. A terrible pain in his stomach, a churning, a pressure building like nothing that had ever been felt before, because nothing had ever been felt before. Let me pause here because this detail matters more than it seems. The first feeling wasn't love, wasn't curiosity, wasn't the desire to create or express or share. The first sensation in the universe was discomfort. The first experience was suffering. And doesn't that track perfectly with what we know about existence? You don't remember being born, but everyone who witnessed it says you came out screaming. The first breath is violent, air forcing its way into lungs that don't know what they're for yet. The first sensation is cold. The first experience is separation from the only warmth you've ever known. We enter existence the same way Mbombo entered creation, through pain and expulsion and the trauma of becoming. Therefore, suffering isn't a corruption of existence, it's the origin of existence. It's not a bug in the code, it's the code itself. When that pressure became unbearable, Mbombo vomited. The first thing that came up was the sun. Can you imagine that? One moment, infinite darkness. The next, this burning sphere of light erupting from a god's mouth, suddenly illuminating an ocean that had never known brightness. The primordial waters reflecting light for the first time. Waves that had moved in perfect darkness for eternity, suddenly visible, suddenly defined, suddenly real in a way they'd never been before. But here's what the elders emphasize, what outsiders always miss. The light didn't make things better at first. It made them worse. Because in the darkness, everything was unified. Everything was the same. There was no here or there, no up or down, no this or that. But light creates shadows. Light creates distinction. Light reveals that things are separate, that you are not the water, that the water is not the darkness, that nothing is actually connected the way it felt when you couldn't see the boundaries. Therefore, the first consequence of light was loss. The loss of unity. The loss of the comfortable delusion that everything is one. Light forced differentiation onto a universe that had been mercifully undifferentiated. And that's why my people say creation was violent. Not because Mbombo was angry, because illumination is always violent, because seeing clearly always hurts more than comfortable blindness. The primordial waters began to evaporate under the sun's heat, receding, exposing things, creating separation where before there had been only uniform darkness. The ocean that had covered everything began to reveal land beneath it. Mud at first, primordial sludge that had never seen light, steaming as the water boiled off it. And here's another detail the elders preserve. The evaporation was painful to witness. The water didn't want to leave. It clung to itself, formed clouds to stay close to the earth, rained back down in desperate attempts to return to the unity it had lost.
But the sun was relentless. Light, once released, cannot be taken back. Differentiation, once begun, cannot be undone. Change had entered the universe, and change is always violent, always unwelcome, always a betrayal of what came before. Therefore the clouds formed from the evaporating water, pregnant with loss, heavy with the memory of unity. And to this day my people say clouds are the saddest part of creation because they're water that can't decide whether to be ocean or sky, stuck between states, never at home anywhere. The moon appeared in Mbombo's second convulsion, smaller than the sun, gentler. A light that doesn't burn, that doesn't force evaporation, that lets things stay hidden if they want to. The moon, the elders say, was Mbombo's body trying to correct the violence of the sun, trying to create illumination without destruction. But it was too late. The sun had already done its work. The moon could only offer consolation, could only light the way for creatures trying to navigate a world the sun had made harsh. then the stars scattered across the newly visible sky like cosmic spittle. Thousands of them, millions of them, each one a small light, a small burning, a small violence, replicated across the entire canvas of existence. And here's what strikes me about the stars. They're described as spittle, not as jewels or lights or divine decorations, as the spray that comes with vomiting, the unintended consequences, the small violences that accompany the large one. When you vomit, you don't just expel what's in your stomach, you spray everything around you, you make a mess. The stars are that mess. Beautiful, yes. But also evidence of how completely creation lacked control or dignity. But Mbombo wasn't done being sick. His stomach still churned with the weight of unrealized creation. And what came next were the animals. The leopard emerged first, sleek and spotted, landing on the newly exposed earth with claws extended, immediately ready to hunt, even though there was nothing yet to hunt. The leopard came out aggressive, came out ready for violence, because it understood instinctively what kind of world it had been born into. My people say the leopard was first, because it represents power and cunning, the qualities you need to survive in a world that wasn't designed for your comfort, not strength. The elephant is stronger, not speed, the gazelle is faster, but cunning combined with sufficient strength to act on that cunning. The intelligence to see opportunities and the force to seize them. That's what the leopard means. That's why it came first. The eagle came next because you need vision to navigate this accident of existence. You need to see from above, need perspective, need to understand the patterns that aren't visible from ground level. The eagle doesn't just see prey, it sees terrain, weather, the movement of entire ecosystems. It understands the big picture. And in a world created by accident, understanding patterns is the only advantage you get. And the crocodile, ancient and patient, because survival requires waiting in the water for opportunities to emerge. The crocodile doesn't chase, doesn't expend energy hunting. It waits at the boundary between water and land, between two states of being, and when something crosses that boundary, it strikes. The crocodile understands that in an accidental universe, timing matters more than effort. Patience matters more than passion. Being in the right place at the right time, with the right preparation, that's what survival requires. One by one, Mbombo vomited up every creature, the turtle and the heron, and the beetle and the goat, the snake and the elephant and the fish, each one a separate heave, a separate spasm of divine nausea, each one landing in this new world without instruction, without purpose, without any explanation of what they were supposed to do or be. My people don't romanticize this. We don't say the animals were crafted with care or formed by loving hands. They were expelled, ejected from the void inside a suffering God. They came out covered in whatever passes for divine bile. They came out disoriented and afraid. They came out into a world that was still forming, still steaming from the sun's heat, still not sure what it was or what it was becoming. Therefore, every living thing carries this origin. We are all products of pain, all accidents seeking purpose. We are all expelled rather than invited. We are all here because something greater than us couldn't stand holding us inside anymore. But the most important vomiting, the one that changed everything, was when Mbombo brought up the first humans. 3 of them. Not 2, like your Adam and Eve story, 3. And this number matters. 2 creates opposition, male and female, good and evil, us and them. 2 forces you into binary thinking, into choosing sides. But 3 creates complexity. 3 creates the possibility of mediation, of balance, of tension that doesn't have to resolve into conflict. 3 people can vote, can build consensus, can create something more nuanced than simple opposition. Therefore, the first humans were designed, accidentally designed, but still, to avoid the trap of binary thinking. to understand from the beginning that reality is more complex than opposites. These three humans, the elders, don't usually name them because naming creates hierarchy, and these three were equal, looked around at the newly formed world, at the sun burning above them and the animals scrambling across the damp earth, and they understood immediately what the pretty creation myths never admit. Nobody planned this for us. Nobody designed this world with our needs in mind. Nobody considered our comfort or our desires or our capacity to suffer. We weren't the culmination of divine intent. We weren't the purpose toward which all creation had been building. We were just another thing that came up when a god felt sick. One more heave in a series of heaves. One more accident in a universe of accidents. And that understanding, that immediate recognition of their own cosmic irrelevance was the first truly human thought. Because animals don't know their accidents. Animals just live, just survive, just exist without the burden of understanding. But humans looked around and knew they were expelled rather than invited, knew they were unplanned rather than purposed, knew they would have to create their own meaning because none had been provided. That's what makes us human in the Kuba story. Not intelligence or tool use or language, but the specific burden of knowing we were vomited into existence and having to decide what to do with that knowledge. But Mbombo, exhausted from all this vomiting, wasn't finished with creation. He couldn't be, because what he'd expelled was raw and incomplete. Functional maybe, but barely. Like a rough draft, like the first attempt at anything, recognizable but not refined. Therefore he had three sons, Nyonye Ngana, Chonganda, and Chedi Bumba. And these children, these divine offspring, had to finish what their father had started so violently. Notice what this implies about creation. Even for a god, it requires collaboration. Even divine beings can't do it alone. Even Mbombo, powerful enough to vomit up the universe, needed help making it functional. Western theology is obsessed with the omnipotence of a singular God, everything from nothing, perfect and complete, all in 6 days. But the Kuba story is more honest. Creation is a process. It's collaborative. It requires revision and refinement and multiple generations working on the same project. Therefore, the idea that any one person, any one generation, any one culture has the complete and final truth about existence is revealed as absurd. If even gods need their children to finish their work, how arrogant must humans be to claim complete understanding? Nyonye Ngana created the white ants. Termites seems minor, right? In the grand catalogue of creation, sun, moon, stars, animals, humans, why dedicate one of the divine sons to making termites? Except white ants, termites, they break down dead matter. They consume wood and vegetation. They transform decay into soil. They make death useful. Therefore, his creation wasn't about adding beauty to the world, but about introducing the cycle of decomposition and renewal, making sure nothing is permanent, making sure everything that exists will eventually be consumed and reformed into something else. My grandfather used to take me to abandoned houses in the village, structures that had been left empty for years. He'd show me how the termites had hollowed out the support beams, how the walls were collapsing, how the forest was reclaiming what humans had built. And he'd say, "See, Nyonye Ngana is still working, still making sure nothing human believes it's permanent." Because that's what the termites mean. They're not just insects, they're the embodiment of a fundamental truth. Everything you build will be unmade. Everything you create will be consumed. Everything you think is solid is actually hollow, just waiting for the right pressure to collapse. The termites are a correction to human arrogance, a reminder that we don't get to decide what lasts. Chonganda made the plants, every green thing that grows from the earth, every leaf and root and flower. But notice the order here. Notice what it reveals about the Kuba understanding of how existence actually works versus how it should work. The animals came first, vomited up by Mbombo himself, then the plants created by his son. Most cultures reverse this. Genesis does it backward. Plants on day 3, animals on days 5 and 6, because it makes logical sense. Herbivores need plants to eat. Carnivores need herbivores.
You build a foundation before you build the house. But the Kuba story doesn't care about your logic. It cares about what actually happened. And what actually happened was messy and backward and required correction. The animals existed before their food source. Therefore they suffered. Therefore they were hungry. Therefore they competed for whatever they could find in the primordial mud, whatever nutrients hadn't evaporated with the water. Therefore the first age of creation was defined by starvation and desperation. And Chonganda had to fix his father's incomplete expulsion, had to look at these suffering creatures and create what they needed to survive. This is so much more honest than the neat, logical progression of other creation myths. Because look at evolution. Look at the fossil record. Does it show a neat progression from simple to complex, from plants to animals, everything in perfect order? No. It shows false starts and dead ends, and creatures that evolved for environments that no longer existed by the time they were born into them. It shows suffering and waste, and constant adaptation to systems that weren't designed for anyone's benefit. The Kuba story knew this 3,000 years before Darwin, knew that existence isn't logical, that it's a series of corrections and adaptations and attempts to fix problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And Chedi Bumba? He created the birds. Wait, you're thinking, didn't Mbombo already vomit up the eagle? Yes, but Chedi made the rest of them, all the birds that fill the sky with movement and song. All the small birds, the ones that don't hunt or dominate but just exist, just sing, just decorate the air with their presence. And here's what the elders say about this. Mbombo could only vomit up the powerful ones. The eagle and the leopard and the crocodile, these are creatures of force and violence. These are things a suffering god would contain. But songbirds? Parrots and weavers and tiny things that serve no purpose except beauty? Those required intention. Those required someone to look at the harsh world Mbombo had created and decide it needed something that wasn't just about survival. Therefore, even divine creation requires collaboration and revision. The first draft is always about power and survival. Beauty comes later, when someone with enough distance can look at what was made and add what was missing. Art, the elders say, is always a response to violence. Beauty is always an attempt to correct harshness. The songbirds are proof that even gods need editors, need their children to add grace notes to the brutal symphony they've composed. But here's where the story gets really uncomfortable, where it stops being about cosmic mechanics and starts being about moral failure and divine rage, and the problem of perfection in an imperfect world. One of Mbombo's sons, Tsetsi, decided he could do better than his father. He looked at this jagged, imperfect world that had been vomited into existence and thought, I can make something perfect. I can create without the mess, without the mistakes, without the suffering. I can prove that creation doesn't have to be violent. So Tsetsi created the chameleon. Beautiful creature, adaptable, capable of changing its skin to match any environment, any situation, any threat. A creature of perfect camouflage, perfect adaptation. The ultimate survival machine. The chameleon doesn't need to be fast like the leopard, or strong like the crocodile, or wise like the eagle. It just needs to become whatever the situation requires. It can be green in the leaves, brown on the bark, grey on stone. It can slow its heartbeat to near death when threatened, can survive without food for weeks, can regrow its tail if lost. Perfect adaptation, perfect resilience, perfect survival. And Mbombo saw what his son had made, this perfect creature, and he was furious. Not because the chameleon was bad or evil or dangerous, not because it threatened anything or anyone, but because it was too good. Because perfection doesn't belong in a world that began with vomiting and pain. Therefore, Mbombo punished Tsetse, drove him into exile for the sin of trying to impose order on cosmic chaos, banished him from the heavens for daring to suggest that creation could be refined beyond its violent origins. And the chameleon remained, a beautiful reminder that perfection is possible but unwelcome, that the world wasn't designed to reward optimization, that attempting to transcend the violence of your origins is itself a sin worthy of exile. But this is the part outsiders always misunderstand, missionaries especially. They hear, the chameleon is perfect, and think it's blessed. They think Tsetse was honored for his achievement. They completely miss that the whole point is punishment. My people know better. The chameleon is cursed precisely because it's perfect.
Think about what it means to always adapt, to never have a true form, to always be changing yourself to match your environment. The chameleon can never rest, can never say, "This is who I am," can never stop performing, stop adapting, stop becoming whatever others need it to be. It has to constantly change itself to survive in a world that doesn't want it as it is. It can never relax into authenticity because authenticity is a luxury it cannot afford. Therefore, the pursuit of perfection is revealed as a trap, a burden, a punishment disguised as achievement. The chameleon doesn't thrive because it's perfect. It survives because it has no choice but to constantly destroy whatever self it managed to construct and rebuild it according to the demands of its current environment. My aunt once told me about her son who went to university in Europe, came back speaking perfect French, wearing European clothes, adapting to every situation he entered. And she said, "He's become a chameleon, perfectly adapted to everything and at home nowhere. Tsetse's curse upon my house." That's what the chameleon means. It's not just about a lizard. It's about the violence of perfection, the loneliness of optimization, the curse of never being allowed to be yourself because yourself isn't good enough for a world that demands constant adaptation. After this punishment, after this demonstration that even divine beings will be punished for attempting to correct the fundamental violence of existence, Mbombo withdrew. He'd vomited up the raw materials of existence. His sons had refined them into something like a functioning world. He'd punished the attempt to make it perfect, had made it clear that improvement beyond a certain point is transgression. His work was done. So he retreated into the heavens, into the sky he'd accidentally created, and left humanity to figure out the rest. No commandments, no instruction manual, no promise of intervention or salvation or reward for good behavior. Just, here's what came up when I was sick. Good luck with all of it. And honestly, that absence feels more honest than any promise of divine oversight. Because look around at the world. Does it look like anyone's watching? Does it feel like there's a plan? Does it seem like someone intervenes when children suffer, when the innocent are destroyed, when cruelty thrives and kindness is punished? Or does it feel exactly like you'd expect if everything started with a god vomiting into an ocean of darkness and then walking away? The absence isn't abandonment, the elders say. It's honesty. It's Mbombo refusing to pretend he has answers he doesn't have or control he doesn't possess. He made you by accident. He improved you through his children's work. He punished the attempt to perfect you. And then he left. What else would you expect him to do? Stay and lie about having a plan? Stay and pretend your suffering means something? Stay and watch you pray to him for help he can't provide? The withdrawal is mercy. It's the only mercy we get. The freedom to not waste our time appealing to someone who already told us he has nothing else to offer. There's something profound in Mbombo's withdrawal that connects to how the Kuba people actually live, how we've structured our societies, and our understanding of responsibility. Most religions give you a God who stays involved, who watches, who judges, who cares, supposedly, about every sparrow that falls and every hair on your head. And what does that theology create? Helplessness, dependency, the constant appeal to authority.
the prostration before power, the prayer instead of action. But Mbombo left, and in leaving, he forced us to take responsibility for our own existence. There's no point praying to Mbombo because he's already gone. There's no point asking him to fix things because he didn't fix them when he was here. There's no point waiting for divine intervention because the divine has already intervened as much as it's going to, which is to say, accidentally, through nausea, and then it left. Therefore, we had to create our own systems of justice and morality and meaning. Not because a god commanded them, not because we'll be rewarded for following them or punished for violating them, but because we're here, in this world we didn't choose, and we need ways to live together that don't destroy us. The Kuba people developed a complex political system. We had a king, yes, but surrounded by councils and checks on power. We had rules about who could speak and when. We had requirements for consensus. We had systems for resolving disputes that involved the whole community, not just appealing to authority. And when missionaries asked why we didn't have religious law, why we didn't base our justice system on divine command, my great-grandfather said, "Mbombo left. Why would we wait for someone who's already gone?" This isn't atheism. We acknowledge that Mbombo exists, that creation happened, that there is something divine. But we don't confuse existence with involvement. We don't mistake creation with caring. And maybe that's the most mature relationship with the divine possible, acknowledging it without depending on it. Compare this to how colonizers approached us. They came with their book and their God who loves you and watches you and cares deeply about your behavior. And what did they do with that theology? They used it to justify enslavement and exploitation and genocide. God has a plan, they said, while their plan was to extract everything of value and leave us with nothing. The Lord works in mysterious ways, they said, while the only mystery was how they reconciled their theology of love with their practice of violence. But you can't do that with Mbombo. You can't invoke divine will to justify your cruelty because Mbombo doesn't have a will for you. You can't claim God is on your side because Mbombo isn't on anyone's side. You can't say suffering builds character because Mbombo already told you suffering is just the default state. It doesn't build anything, it's just what existence is. Therefore, Mbombo's absence becomes a kind of ethical protection. It prevents the weaponization of the divine. It stops you from claiming cosmic authority for your human cruelty. My uncle used to say, "The worst violence humans do, they do in God's name." Lucky for us, our God has no name we can use that way. This is why when missionaries told us about Jesus, about a God who loved us so much he died for us, many Kuba people were suspicious rather than grateful. "Why would a God die for you?" my grandmother asked the missionary. "Because he loves us," the missionary said. "Then why do you suffer?" she asked. "To test our faith," he said. "To test your faith in a God who died because he loves you." "Yes." "Mbombo vomited and left," she said. "At least that makes sense. Because here's the thing, a God who loves you and watches you and cares about you, but still lets you suffer, creates an unbearable psychological burden. You have to explain the suffering. You have to justify it. You have to make it mean something. But a God who vomited and left, that's clean. Suffering doesn't need justification. It doesn't need to mean anything. It just is. And that's actually liberating, because if suffering doesn't mean anything, you're free to reduce it without worrying that you're interfering with some divine plan. You're free to fight against it without wondering if you're going against God's will. You're free to rage against the dying of the light without thinking you're committing some cosmic sin. The absence of divine oversight is the permission to improve your condition without spiritual guilt. There's a variant of the Mbombo story, a darker thread that some elders tell and others prefer to forget. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's uncomfortable even for us. Even for people raised on a creation myth about divine vomiting. In this version, death wasn't part of the original vomiting. Death came later, as a consequence, as a necessary corruption. Because when Mbombo created humans by accident, he created them immortal. Not on purpose, not as a gift, just by default, because death hadn't been invented yet. And at first, maybe this seemed fine. 3 humans in a new world, exploring, learning, surviving. But time kept passing. The sun kept rising and setting. The moon kept cycling. And the humans kept existing. They saw animals die, saw the leopard kill and the crocodile drown prey, and the eagle drop creatures from heights that shattered them. Death existed for animals, but not for humans. And slowly, over years or centuries, the story isn't clear on time because time didn't work the same way then. The humans realized something terrible. Immortality in an imperfect world is torture, not blessing. Think about it. You can't escape your mistakes because you never die. You can't escape the people you've wronged because they never die either. You can't escape the accumulation of pain and memory and trauma because it just keeps building forever with no release. The animals had it better. They lived, they suffered, they died. Clean cycle. But humans just lived and suffered and kept living. And one day, the elders say it was one of the original 3, but they don't agree on which one. One of the first humans went to the place where Mbombo had ascended into the sky, the place where the boundary between earth and heaven was thinnest, and called up to the Creator. "You made us wrong," the human said. "I made you by accident," Mbombo replied. "I didn't make you any particular way. You made us to suffer forever. I made you to exist. The suffering is what existence is. Then let us not exist anymore." And Mbombo, in the only act of mercy the story credits to him, granted that request. He created death, not as punishment for sin, not as consequence of disobedience, but as mercy, as the only real gift he ever gave intentionally. He made it so that everything that came from his vomiting would eventually return to nothing, so that the accident of existence could at least be temporary, so that suffering, which was infinite in duration if not intensity, could at least have an end point. Think about what that means for how the Kuba people understand death. In most creation myths, death is a punishment, the consequence of eating the wrong fruit, or disobeying the wrong command, or cosmic rebellion. Death is what happens when you fail the test of existence. But in the Mbombo story, death is a gift. The only gift the Creator ever gave intentionally. Everything else, the sun and the animals and the plants and the humans, all of it was just divine nausea, accidents and corrections and attempts to make the accidents functional. But death was chosen, death was designed, death was given in direct response to a human request for mercy. Therefore, the only thing in this entire universe that was created on purpose is the thing that ends us. My grandmother told me this version on her deathbed. She was 93, blind, barely able to speak. I was holding her hand and crying because I didn't want her to go. And she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Mbombo's gift. The only one he gave on purpose. Don't cry. This is mercy." And she was right. Because what's the alternative? Eternal existence in a world that wasn't designed for comfort. Infinite accumulation of memory and pain and loss. Watching everyone you love suffer forever because death isn't available to release them. When you really think about it, when you sit with the horror of immortality in an imperfect world, death stops looking like a curse and starts looking like the only reasonable response to the problem of existence. But here's where it gets even more profound. If death is mercy, if death is the gift, then life is the burden. Life is what we're stuck with between the accident of birth and the mercy of death. And that reframes everything. It means life isn't sacred because it's precious. Life is sacred because it's temporary, because it's the burden we carry until we're granted release. It means our job isn't to extend life as long as possible or treat death as the enemy. Our job is to make the burden bearable, to reduce suffering while we're stuck in existence, to help each other carry the weight until mercy arrives. The Kuba people don't have elaborate afterlives in our theology. We don't have heaven or hell, or reincarnation, or any promise of continued existence. Death is the end, the return to nothing, the dissolution of the accident. And that's okay. That's the point. That's the mercy. You existed because a god felt sick. You'll stop existing because that same god finally agreed to let you rest. Everything in between is what you make of it, and it doesn't have to mean anything beyond what meaning you can construct. So what does it mean to live in a world you know was vomited into existence? How does the Mbombo story shape actual life, actual choices, actual ways of being? First, it creates profound humility. You can't be arrogant about your existence when you know you're an accident. You can't claim special status or divine favor or cosmic purpose when your origin story is literally divine nausea. This doesn't mean you can't have dignity. My people have tremendous dignity. But it's earned dignity, constructed dignity, not assumed dignity based on creation. We're dignified because we've chosen to be, because we've decided that even accidents can have value, not because some god declared us special. Second, it creates radical responsibility. If nobody planned this for you, if nobody's watching, if nobody's going to save you, then you have to save yourself. You have to build your own meaning. You have to create your own justice. You have to construct your own ethics from scratch. This is harder than following divine commandments. It's much harder. But it's also more honest. And it creates a different kind of moral person. Not someone who's good because they'll be rewarded or punished, but someone who's good because they've decided goodness is worth constructing in an indifferent universe. Third, it creates a specific relationship with suffering. We don't try to explain suffering away. We don't pretend it serves a purpose. We don't claim it builds character or tests faith or is part of some divine plan. Suffering is just the default state of existence. It's what you get for being vomited into an imperfect world.
Therefore, the goal isn't to understand suffering or find meaning in it.
The goal is to reduce it where you can and endure it where you can't. My people don't ask, why do bad things happen to good people? We ask, how can we help each other survive the badness that happens to everyone? Fourth, it creates a completely different approach to death. We don't fear death the way cultures with heaven and hell do. We don't spend our lives worrying about the afterlife. We don't build elaborate theologies about what happens when you die. Death is release. It's rest. It's the end of carrying the burden of existence. Therefore, we grieve death because we'll miss the person, not because we're worried about where they've gone. And we celebrate a life well lived as someone who carried the burden with grace, not as someone who passed some cosmic test. My people gather around fires and celebrate Mbombo. We don't build temples to his glory or sing songs about his wisdom. We don't pray to him or ask him for things or expect him to intervene. We acknowledge him. We respect that he vomited up the universe. We understand that his withdrawal wasn't abandonment, but honesty. We thank him for the gift of death. And then we turn to each other and say, okay, we're stuck here. Let's make it bearable. Because what else would you do? What else could you do? You could lie to yourself and pretend there's a plan. You could construct elaborate theologies about why suffering exists and what it means. You could pray to absent gods and wait for salvation that isn't coming. Or you could look directly at the truth. We're accidents in an accidental universe. We're here temporarily. Nobody planned this. Nobody's watching. And the only mercy we get is death. And having looked at that truth, having really sat with it, you could decide, fine, if this is all we get, let's make it count. Let's reduce suffering where we can. Let's create beauty even though it's temporary. Let's love each other even though we'll lose each other. Let's build meaning even though it's constructed rather than discovered. Let's be chameleons when we have to, adapting to survive. But let's also be songbirds when we can, adding beauty to a harsh world. Let's accept the termite's lesson about impermanence. Let's use the eagle's vision to see patterns. Let's employ the leopard's cunning to seize opportunities. Let's practice the crocodile's patience while we wait. Because we're all here in this vomited-up world, whether we want it to be or not. And that creates a kind of solidarity, a kind of kinship. We're all accidents together. We're all carrying the burden together. We're all waiting for mercy together. So we might as well help each other while we wait. The next time someone tells you a creation story that's all intention and design and divine love, ask yourself, does that sound like the world you actually live in? Does it explain wars and famines and diseases? Does it explain why children suffer and why cruelty thrives? Does it explain the casual indifference of nature, the way the universe seems completely unconcerned with human welfare? Or does it sound more honest to say, we're all just here because something greater than us felt sick one day? We're all accidents in an accidental universe. We're all carrying a burden we never agreed to carry. And we're all waiting for the only mercy we were promised, the mercy of eventually being allowed to stop. Because I look at wars and disease and the casual cruelty of nature, and I don't see a loving architect. I don't see divine providence or cosmic justice, or any sign that someone planned this for our benefit. I see exactly what my grandmothers described, the aftermath of divine vomiting, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to our comfort. The sun that came up when Mbombo first vomited doesn't care if it burns you. The leopard that emerged from his nausea doesn't care if it hunts you. The termites his son created don't care if they destroy what you built. Nothing cares. That's the point. That's the truth the Mbombo story forces you to confront. And somehow that's enough. Not because it's comforting, but because it's honest. And in a world full of comfortable lies, honesty is the only foundation solid enough to build meaning on. So we build, we create, we love, we struggle, we endure. Not because a God commanded it, not because we'll be rewarded, but because we're here, we're accidents, and we've decided that even accidents can choose to matter. We've decided that even in a vomited-up world, beauty is worth making. That even knowing we're temporary, connection is worth forming. That even waiting for death's mercy, life is worth living well.
That's what the Mbombo story teaches. Not comfort, not purpose, but the honest foundation on which real meaning can be built. We're all here by accident. We're all suffering. We're all going to die. And in the space between those truths, we have the freedom to decide what matters. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. That's the gift Mbombo gave us by leaving. The freedom to be more than accidents. The responsibility to create more than chaos. The dignity of choosing meaning in a meaningless universe. And maybe that's the most honest theology possible. A God who vomited and left. Creatures who suffer and adapt. A world that doesn't care. And people who choose to care anyway. Because someone has to. And it might as well be us.